I think we can have a legitimate conversation about LSU potentially punching their ticket to Atlanta in the SEC championship, but they're going to have to beat Ole Miss to keep that alive. How do they do that? We'll get into that on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube as well. So just search Locked On LSU in the search bar, hit that subscribe button, and you won't miss a single second of your Locked On LSU content. And of course, Locked On LSU is part of the Locked On Network, your team every day. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every day. I've been covering LSU football since 2016. I graduated from LSU, and I now host a sports talk radio show in Nashville, Tennessee. I also want to let y'all know that today's edition of Locked On LSU is brought to you by Underdog. You can sign up on UnderdogFantasy.com with the promo code LOCKEDON and get your first deposit doubled up to $100. So who doesn't like free money? Now, I want to have a serious talk. And it's a conversation that I never thought would necessarily be in the cards for this team preseason. That's not a knock on Brian Kelly. That's not a knock on this team. It's just a knock simply on the situation that LSU football found itself in going into this year. First-year head coach, completely new coaching staff, a quarterback competition, and kind of question marks surrounding all of the quarterbacks that were in that quarterback competition. I didn't think that we were going to have this conversation. But I think at this point, if LSU beats Ole Miss, we can have that conversation. And that's the conversation about LSU potentially punching their ticket to Atlanta. They win the West and compete in the SEC championship. And I know, you're probably rolling your eyes. You probably think that's ridiculous. I know that LSU still has a good bit of their murderer's row left on their schedule. I know they still have to play Ole Miss this weekend. I know they still got Alabama. I know that they still have to travel to College Station later on this season and take on Texas A&M. I know they still have to play Arkansas. There's a really long way to go. But if LSU beats Ole Miss this weekend, we can have those conversations. We can have a legitimate conversation about if LSU can win the SEC West. Right now, Ole Miss runs the table. Ole Miss is entering this game 7-0. Ole Miss is undefeated, albeit you can look at that with maybe a little bit of an asterisk. I'm sure a lot of Ole Miss fans don't want to, but I personally do, because I look at Ole Miss being 7-0 and I see their wins over a really down bad Auburn team. I see their win against Vanderbilt. I see their wins against a close win against Tulsa. I see their very narrow win against a Kentucky team that, in my opinion, I really did think that Kentucky lost that game more than Ole Miss won that game. It was a close game. It came down to the wire. Ultimately, Will Levis fumbled the ball twice in the red zone, and that really sealed the deal for Kentucky. I don't want to take anything away from Ole Miss. They still had to play those games. They still had to win those games. But if I'm going to compare Ole Miss's schedule to, let's say, LSU's, or really a majority of other teams in the SEC, Ole Miss has had it a lot easier than a lot of other teams, especially LSU, has so far this season. I don't want to discredit this team. It's a good team. They've got a ton of talent. Lane Kiffin is a good coach. But still, I mean, Ole Miss is 7-0 with more inferior opponents. And I'll just leave it at that. But Ole Miss runs the table in the West after Alabama lost to Tennessee. Alabama has 1 loss. LSU has 2. Ole Miss has 0. If LSU beats Ole Miss, and if LSU wins out, which is so much easier said than done, LSU wins the West. It all comes down to Saturday, though, because if LSU loses to Ole Miss, then they could win out and they're not going to win the West. It would most likely be Ole Miss unless Ole Miss slips up along the way, which they do have very difficult games coming down the schedule. They've still got Alabama. They've still got A&M, just like LSU has. Ole Miss also has a murderer's row coming down the pipe. But these conversations become realistic if LSU beats Ole Miss. And I'm not saying LSU has a guaranteed spot in Atlanta if LSU beats Ole Miss, because they still got to beat Alabama. They still got to beat Arkansas. They still got to beat A&M. And even though you may feel better about LSU being able to get a win against Arkansas or a win on the road at College Station, maybe you feel better about that now than you did going into this season. Texas A&M, a top 10 team. Arkansas was a team that a lot of people were very high on. I go back to Jordan Rodgers, or before the season, freaking out about Arkansas, thinking that they were by far the third best team in the SEC. I think so far we've learned that is not necessarily the case. And if you're watching on YouTube, my camera is messing up, so I'm sorry about that. But anyways, this game has big time SEC West implications. I think the nation is looking at Ole Miss and saying, okay, you've been able to go undefeated against Auburn and Vanderbilt and Tulsa, so on and so forth. But this is Ole Miss's biggest test. And if they can pass this test, if Ole Miss can beat LSU in Tiger Stadium on CBS primetime, I think people are going to take Ole Miss a lot more seriously. I've seen a lot of jokes talking about, undefeated teams in the SEC before this past week, before Tennessee beat Alabama, how all the conversation was about Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia, and there was no conversation about Ole Miss. And that's no knock on Ole Miss. I think it's just the fact that, Tennessee had more impressive wins. That Alabama is Alabama and Georgia is the reigning national champion. But this is Ole Miss's biggest test by far. This is going to be the best defense that Ole Miss's offense has seen by far. This is going to be the most difficult environment that Jaxson Dart has played in the SEC by far. So Ole Miss is going to be tested. And if they can pass this test, then I think we can have a serious conversation about Ole Miss potentially upsetting Alabama and maybe seeing an Ole Miss Georgia or an Ole Miss Tennessee SEC championship. But they've got to pass this test first. If LSU beats Ole Miss, then I think we can have those conversations about, can LSU beat Alabama? I mean, I don't think that's the craziest thing. I'm not going to pick it right now. I don't think that, where it stands right now, that I think LSU could beat Alabama, but I don't know. We'll see. But I think we could have conversations about LSU potentially going to Atlanta. I know that sounds crazy. It's still early. I get it. I know. But I think we can have those conversations. But it all comes down to this test on Saturday. LSU is going to have a hard time. Ole Miss has got a really solid run game. Ole Miss could have a hard time being in a really rowdy and raucous environment, and this being their most difficult game on their schedule so far. So what's it going to be? Is LSU going to pass, or is Ole Miss going to pass? Coming up next, I want to get into how LSU could fail this test against Ole Miss. I want to get into that coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about something that is very important, and that is Underdog Fantasy. So Underdog Fantasy is, I think, different than any other sports book or any kind of fantasy. It's the easiest place to spice up your college football season. Super, super easy to get started. All you got to do is just sit there on the couch watching all the games, whip your phone out, download the app in the App Store. You can go to their website and then start playing. So the point of Underdog is that you pick like 2 to 5 players and you simply just pick higher or lower, over or under. Look at the different pick'em choices for LSU this week, or you can pick any other team. So I am going to be looking for Jayden Daniels over passing yards, because I think after last week at Florida, I'm hoping at least he's found something in this passing game, that he's going to find this chemistry and something finally clicked with this LSU offense and with Jayden Daniels and with his receivers. So I'm going to take Jayden Daniels over passing yards. But, I mean, if you're looking at the Syracuse-Clemson game, you could go Sean Tucker lower than 93.5 rushing yards. I mean, Clemson is a really tough team to run against. So you can look at LSU, you can look at Syracuse, you can look at Clemson, you can look at any of the college football games this weekend, but just do it with Underdog. It's super easy to play. It's available in over 30 states. So you just pick between 2 to 5 players, like I mentioned, decide if they finish higher or lower, and it's a super easy fantasy game to play. You can play it with your friends, and you can win cold, hard cash in a single game. I mean, getting paid to watch football, isn't that like everyone's dream? So sign up with the promo code LOCKEDON, one word, and Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100. To deposit $100, you get a free $100. Go to UnderdogFantasy.com or find the Underdog Fantasy app in the App Store or Google Play Store. That's Underdog Fantasy, promo code LOCKEDON, one word. Get in on the college football pick'em action today. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Plus, we're on YouTube as well. You can also follow me on Twitter at CarolineFenton1. You can get all your content, all the college football good stuff. YouTube for podcast platform, and of course, on Twitter as well. I also want to let y'all know that starting next week, I haven't done this in a while, but I want to bring it back. I want to do a mailbag Wednesday moving forward. So if you have some questions, things that you want me to touch on, concerns, whatever it is about LSU football, LSU athletics, LSU as a whole, feel free to send those in. So you can comment on the YouTube page. You can tweet me at Caroline Fenton 1. You can tweet the podcast at Locked On LSU. You can send me a DM. Whichever you prefer, just get your questions in and I'll make sure to get to those questions on a Mailbag Wednesday next week. But how could LSU lose this game? I mean, this has big-time SEC West implications. LSU undefeated in the SEC West, Ole Miss undefeated, period. So this has potentially big-time SEC West implications. But how could LSU kind of fail this test? 3 ways that LSU could lose this game. First and foremost, I think it's pretty obvious if you watched any Ole Miss football this year, that they are really freaking good in the run game. So my first way that LSU could lose this game is if they let Ole Miss run all over them. And I think that's pretty simple. If they give up a bunch of rushing yards and big time plays to Ole Miss's run game, then LSU loses. And that's, I could say it's as simple as that. If they stop the run, they win. If they don't, they lose. But they've got this running back duo between Quinshon Judkins and Zach Evans that I believe is the best in the SEC and potentially has a case for being the best in college football. I mean, Quinshon Judkins is averaging about 100 yards per game, which is the second best in the SEC. He has 2 rushing touchdowns in all but 3 games. He's got 10 rushing touchdowns as a whole, a total on the season. Quinshon Judkins is the real deal. And it's not just about him, because if it was just Quinshon Judkins, I think that's a big enough threat. But Zach Evans is his little partner in the run game, and he's averaging about 87 yards per game, which is good for 5th best in the SEC. So Ole Miss has the 2nd and 5th best running backs in the SEC in terms of yards per game. That is very intimidating. Zach Evans has 7 rushing touchdowns on the season. He has at least 1 touchdown in every game this season, except the Central Arkansas game earlier this season. I'm gonna be honest with y'all, I didn't watch that game. I don't want to watch Ole Miss Central Arkansas, but I can only imagine he was either taken out of that game early, wasn't used a lot in that game, or just couldn't find the end zone. Either one. But yeah, between Quinshon Judkins and Zach Evans, this LSU defense is going to have their hands full in the run game. Ole Miss has the most rushing yards total in the SEC by far. So far, Ole Miss has 1,900 yards total, rushing yards total, and that is the best in the SEC. The second best is Arkansas with 1,680. So Ole Miss has over 200 more yards than any other team in the SEC. That's insane. They've got the most rushing yards per game in the SEC. They're averaging 270 yards per game. I mean, that is a scary stat. And to put that in perspective, LSU has the 7th most total rushing yards in the SEC with 1,214. Pretty big drop off there. It's like a 700-yard difference. That's a big difference. But let's look at LSU's rush defense. How can they stop this team? Can they stop this team? I think you might look at, most recently the Florida game, and you could look at the amount of yards that LSU gave up and say, okay, well, LSU doesn't have a very good rush defense. But I think that the Florida game stats are a little bit misleading. So LSU gave up 210 rushing yards to Florida on 33 carries, which is a lot. But if you take out those big running plays, those chunk running plays that Florida had, that 81-yard touchdown run from Anthony Richardson, the 39-yard run from Montreal Johnson, I know that you can't take those out. I know that's not how football works. I know that you can't just cherry pick stats and take out whichever numbers you want and use whatever numbers you want. I understand that. But that was about 120 yards total. Actually, I think it is to the dot, 120 yards, whatever, math is hard. 120 yards on the ground in 2 plays. So if you take that out, then LSU only gave up 90 yards on 31 carries. So the key for LSU is to limit the big plays. Because if you take out those big Florida plays, LSU had a pretty good day stopping Florida's run game. And I mentioned last week just how good Florida's run game was. They had a really solid trio of running backs, and then you add Anthony Richardson in there, and that's a really stout run game. But they were able to limit them to just 90 yards minus the big chunk plays. So the key here for LSU's rush defense is to limit the chunk plays, limit the 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80-yard runs from Ole Miss. Just stop them at the line of scrimmage. And if they pick up, they're going to pick up 2, 3, 4 yards a crack. They're going to do that. But if LSU can hold them to that, I think that they're going to be successful, because they held Florida to about 3 yards per carry last week, 31 carries, 90 yards, other than the big chunk plays. And I think that LSU, I would look at that as being a success if LSU is able to limit Ole Miss's rush game to just 3 yards a crack. You could also look at the Tennessee game and say, well, LSU's rush defense was pretty horrendous in that game. And I would probably agree with you, because LSU gave up 263 rush yards on 49 carries and 2 touchdowns against Tennessee. And Tennessee is not an elite run offense. I mean, they're averaging about 200 yards on the ground, which isn't bad, but that's also, LSU gave up way more yards than Tennessee is averaging. I don't know if that was a case of LSU just wasn't ready for that game. I don't know if that was a case of Harold Perkins wasn't used in that game very much, and you didn't have Harold Perkins to kind of be that big-bodied linebacker to stuff some of those holes. I don't know what the case was there, but that is something that I look to say that LSU's run defense can be hot. LSU's run defense also can sometimes struggle tackling and give up those big chunk plays. So a way that LSU could lose is if they allow those big chunk plays to Ole Miss's really good run game. Second way that I think LSU could lose is if they get beat the line of scrimmage. And that's on both sides of the ball, offensively and defensively. So offensively, LSU is in much better shape. Their offensive line is in much better shape with Will Campbell back in the mix. And I think we saw that, the Tennessee game versus the Florida game, just how drastically different those games went. And it didn't just come down to Will Campbell. There were so many other factors there. But I think that you saw some of that comfort with Jayden Daniels in the Florida game, also being with having your more consistent left tackle who's been there the entire season back in the mix. So having Will Campbell makes this offensive line better. But Ole Miss is averaging 19 sacks, second most, not averaging, a total of 19 sacks in the season, That's the second most in the SEC. To put that into perspective, LSU is 6th in the SEC with 14 sacks in the season. And you could say, okay, well, Ole Miss probably sacked Central Arkansas and Tulsa. And yeah, you would be right. But they also got to the quarterback 3 times against Auburn. They got to the quarterback 3 times against Kentucky. Kentucky's offensive line is pretty trash. Poor Will Levis has been, fighting for his life out there. But I'm looking to Jared Ivey, who leads the team in sacks with 3.5. And also, it's not about just double teaming one guy. It's not about focusing in on one guy, because Ole Miss has 10 defensive players with at least 1 sack so far this season. So this LSU offensive line is going to have to do some big time protection across the line as a whole. So I think if LSU is able to protect Jayden Daniels and they're going to give him time to sit back in the pocket like we saw against Florida, LSU is going to be in good shape. But if they lose those offensive defensive line battles there, Jayden Daniels is going to have a tough time. But I think defensively, on the other side, in the trenches on the defensive line, Ole Miss has been really good at run blocking, as you can see, with 2 really solid running backs. But pass blocking, they haven't been very great. So the key for LSU defensively is to get pressure, or is to stop the run game, force Jaxson Dart to have to throw the ball and to get pressure on Jaxson Dart, because the offensive line has proven that they cannot pass block as talentedly, that's not a word, but whatever, as they can run block. So that's another key. If LSU wins or loses this game, if they lose the battles in the trenches, they lose this game. If they win the battles in the trenches, I think they got a pretty great shot. And the third way that I think LSU could lose, and that's going to be, I mentioned it last week, and I'm going to reiterate it today. It's going to be a way that I think LSU can lose until LSU proves to me that they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot like this. But if they make stupid mistakes, if they make dumb penalties, and if they make dumb special teams mistakes, if they're muffin punts, if they're dropping kickoffs, if they're allowing 50, 60, 70-yard punt returns, if they make these silly mistakes and silly penalties, the dumb blocks in the back, the false starts, the pass interferences, any of those mistakes or penalties or drops or whatever it is that gives Ole Miss more opportunities, LSU is going to lose this game. So just keep it clean in special teams, play clean. LSU's done a really great job of not turning the ball over. So they need to continue that as well. But I'm looking to the dumb penalties, the dumb mistakes, and special teams woes that they've been experiencing all season long. They had 2 big time special teams mess ups, oopses against Florida, muffing a punt and then the illegal formation on a Florida punt return. You can't do that against Ole Miss. This is a better team. This Ole Miss team is a better team than Florida is, and they cannot make those mistakes. But coming up next, what does LSU have to do in order for us to start having those potentially realistic conversations about LSU making their way to Atlanta? We'll get into that coming up next. How LSU could win. How LSU can hand the lane train and this Ole Miss team their first loss of the season at home in Tiger Stadium. It's going to be such a great environment. I'm not able to make it to Baton Rouge this weekend, so if y'all are going to be there, enjoy it, have fun for me, cheer extra loud for me, because this game is going to be a really, really fun environment. One way that LSU could win. I mentioned it in a way that LSU could lose, so I'm going to reiterate it here. They have to stop the run game. They have to force Jaxson Dart to throw the football, because I don't think Jaxson Dart is incredibly confident throwing the football. His stats so far this season, not elite, not bad. I think they're pretty much, plain bagel. They're average. 100 for 162. It's about 23 attempts per game. Again, not elite, not crazy. He's not throwing the ball a ton, but he's not throwing the ball. 1,488 yards. That's about 210 yards a game. Again, not elite, not outstanding, not atrocious. Doesn't throw the ball a ton, doesn't not throw the ball. He's got 11 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. And that's the key, I think, here with Jaxson Dart, is he has a lot of throws that I just don't really know where they're going to go. Or he has a lot of throws that I'm like, what are you looking at, brother? So if they can force Jaxson Dart to throw the Ole Miss to victory, I don't think Ole Miss will be very successful. They have found so much offensive success running the ground. I mean, they ran for almost 450 yards. 450 yards against Auburn. 450 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground alone. They want to run the football. If you let Ole Miss run the football, they will. So that's exactly what LSU's got to do. Stop them from running the football. Force Jaxson Dart to throw, and then get pressure on Jaxson Dart. Don't give up those big-time chunk plays. The second way that I think LSU can win this game is if they stop Ole Miss on third down. I didn't know this. Ole Miss is the best team in the country on third down conversions. They're converting 55% of their third downs. I didn't realize they were that good on third down. And I think it's because they probably get themselves in third and short situations, a 3rd and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on and so forth. And they have such a good run game that all they have to do is just step forward and they convert. So if LSU stops Ole Miss on third down and gets them into 3rd and long situations, gets the defense off the field, and gives LSU's offense more opportunity to score points, I think they're going to be successful. So how do you stop Ole Miss on third down? Like I mentioned, force them into 3rd and long situations, forcing penalties, forcing false starts, forcing OPIs, things like that. That's going to push Ole Miss back and set them up into like a 3rd and 15 or a 3rd and 20, which is so much more difficult to convert when you are a run first team. Because ideally, if you set Ole Miss up in, let's say, a 3rd and 15 situation, and your run defense is doing its job, they're not going to be able to convert. That is a passing down through and through. So that's how you force Jaxson Dart to throw the football. Can Jaxson Dart get himself out of a 3rd and 15, 3rd and 20 situation? Probably, but I'm not going to bet on it. So if they stop Ole Miss on third down, I think they're going to be very successful. Another way to do that is with the pass rush. Get pressure on Jaxson Dart. Force him to throw the ball away. Force Jaxson Dart to do things that he doesn't feel comfortable doing. Sack him. Get him on the ground. Push him back. Keep them out of 3rd and short situations, because if Ole Miss, if they're faced with the 3rd and, let's say, 10 or less, they'll most likely convert. The third way that I think LSU can win, keep it up on offense. Balanced offense. Jayden Daniels needs to throw the football. Jayden Daniels needs to throw those deep balls. Jayden Daniels needs to be risky like we saw him against Florida. Jayden Daniels needs to be able to run the ball as well. Ole Miss has not seen a quarterback as mobile as Jayden Daniels is. If Jayden Daniels starts running around, I think that Ole Miss is going to have a tough time trying to stop him. But also, it's not just going to be on Jayden Daniels. It is in the passing game, but on the run side, LSU does their fair share of running the football, and they're really good at it, especially considering that Armani Goodwin will be back in the mix. He's been out for the last three games with a hamstring issue. Surgery went well. Brian Kelly expects him back against Ole Miss. So I think that now that you have Armani Goodwin back, I think you saw Josh Williams last week have his best game of the season. That gives him a whole lot of confidence. Jayden Daniels having, the game of his career last week against Florida. That gives him a ton of confidence. That built chemistry between him and Quinshon Boutte. Quinshon Boutte also with his best game of the season last week. I think LSU has all of this offensive momentum that we haven't seen from them yet. And they've got to carry it into this Ole Miss game. Run the football. Jayden Daniels has got to make those big time throws that I didn't know if he could make, but he proved to me last week that he can. LSU is going to be successful. So 3 ways that I think LSU could win: stop the run game, force Jaxson Dart to throw, keep Ole Miss in 3rd and long situations, don't let them convert on 3rd down, get that defense off the field, and Jayden Daniels in the run offense doing their thing and piecing together the really good Jayden Daniels that we saw against Florida and the really good run offense that we've seen throughout the season. That's how I think LSU could beat Ole Miss, and that's how I think we could next week potentially be having conversations about what LSU needs to do to punch their ticket to the SEC championship. I'm getting ahead of myself. I know that. I understand. But still, hey, Google, stop. Sorry, I set an alarm. My bad. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can find us on YouTube as well. Don't forget to get your questions in for our Mailbag Wednesday coming up next week. You can get those in today, tomorrow, whenever you want. Just send them to me and I'll make sure to get those answered. But you can get more on the SEC by making Locked On SEC your second listen. Everyday host Chris Gordy and the local experts of Locked On take you across the SEC in 30 minutes. Make Locked On SEC your second listen.